Gostaria de chamar então o Dr. DeVault. Treves é biólogo, mestre em biologia e doutor em ecologia. Trabalha como cientista líder no Centro de Pesquisa de Vida Selvagem, no Departamento de Agricultura, USDA, em Ohio. Seus interesses profissionais incluem entendimento e a mitigação de colisões entre veículos e animais, ornitologia aplicada, comportamento de forrageio e nos alimentos em ambientes, bem como a função ecológica de urubus e outros animais carniceiros. Dr. DeVault já publicou mais de 100 artigos científicos e capítulos de livros sobre esse assunto. É biólogo de aviação, certificado e membro da The Wildlife Society. Por favor, doutor.
Okay, first of all, thank you to all of the organizing committee that invited me here today. It's been a great couple days. It's been really nice to hear what all of you are doing here in terms of managing wildlife at airports. And this is my first time south of the equator, so it's been a real experience for me personally as well. My presentation today will be a little bit of a departure from, I think, most of the other talks that you've heard today. My job is research, so my office develops methods and we test products in terms of trying to find the best ways to reduce wildlife on airports and reduce these collisions. So first of all, I wanted just very briefly to tell you who exactly we are in my organization. As you heard, I'm a part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and specifically we're the National Wildlife Research Center. And I apologize for that not showing up very well there, but the National Wildlife Research Center is the U.S. government organization concerned with human-wildlife conflicts. So not just aviation conflicts, but any type of conflict between humans and wildlife. So our headquarters are here in Colorado, and then we have these different field stations all around the country that each specialize on certain types of human-wildlife conflicts. So for example, in Hilo, Hawaii, we have a field station that works on invasive species on islands. So for example, they try to figure out how to remove rats and goats from islands and that type of thing. We have a field station in Logan, Utah that is concerned with predation on livestock by certain types of wildlife. And so those are the types of problems that are worked on all around the country. And then my office in Sandusky, Ohio, which is circled there, is concerned with, again, aviation conflicts, as you know. So we're right up there on Lake Erie, all the way at the very northern part of Ohio. We get a lot of snow. For those of you who don't know what snow is from around here, it's that white stuff that piles up on the ground in the winter. But we have 7 staff members at present. We've had as many as 12 at a time, and we all work on this process together. Also, we work with universities. Several of our staff are adjunct professors at universities throughout the country. We have graduate students and postdocs and operate very much like a university professor conducting research. All of the work that we do at the field station can be summarized into these 4 areas here. Now, we have 30 to 40 studies going on at any one point in time, and I can't obviously tell you about all of those here today. So what I decided to do was to just give you an idea of the types of things that we do in our research in Ohio. And each of these studies can be categorized into one of these 4 areas. First of all, the habitat and food resources management around airports, wildlife dispersal, removal, relocation, and exclusion. So how do we physically keep wildlife out of those important areas at airports? Also, we research ways to detect and predict wildlife movements and behavior so we can try to avoid those areas where you have a high concentration of wildlife. And then this last area is a bit more on the side of basic biology and ecology. So we're really studying the behavior of the birds and other animals in this last area to try to learn how they react to vehicles. And so this is sensory ecology, physiology, and anti-predator behavior. Before I go on, I just wanted to point out that all of the research that we do, we try to publish in scientific journals, and it's all freely available on the internet. I should have put the website up here, I forgot to do that, but if you go into a search engine and you search for National Wildlife Research Center publications, it's very easy to find. And all of our publications you can search for there, and they're all freely available. So here are the specific topics I chose to talk about today, just again to give you an idea of all the types of things that we do. This is not an exhaustive list of our research by any means. First, I want to talk about some of our work into understanding bird movements during migration and just during the breeding season and wintering times around airports. Secondly, I'm going to build on the last presentation a bit and talk about turf grass and alternative land covers for airports, including solar arrays. This next one is an evaluation of an acoustic hailing device. That's just a very loud sound producer that produces a sound in a very narrow beam to harass wildlife. Also, I'll talk about a specific device called an air whip that's used to disperse birds from specific areas. Talk a little bit about avian radar. I've heard avian radar mentioned several times this week. I'll give you an idea of a study that we did to evaluate that avian radar. We'll look at geographic information systems and how we're using those to explore landscape effects around airports. And this last one, the development of specific aircraft lighting that is designed, tuned to the specific visual systems of birds that will alert them to the presence of the aircraft and try to get them out of the way sooner. Okay, first, bird movements. This is Brian Washburn there on the right. That's Brian Dorr on the left. He's another of our scientists at the Mississippi Field Station. And this bird is an osprey. An osprey is a very large fish-eating bird. Matter of fact, they come down here in the winter, at least our winter. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these birds. And these are the GPS transmitters that we use quite often to study bird movements. They're pretty expensive, but the nice thing about these GPS transmitters is you put them on the bird and forget about it. And you get the locations of the birds sent to you via email. And so you know exactly where they're going all the time, and you don't have to follow them around like I used to have to do when I was a grad student. It's much easier now. And you can see they're also solar powered, so they can last for several years with their batteries. One of the projects that Brian Washburn was involved in was funded by the US military. And they had a problem of striking these osprey during their training flights in certain areas of the US. And so the idea behind this project was to learn how high the osprey fly and at what times they fly and where they fly, so that the military could avoid those areas that were, and the times that were very high risk. And so this is the type of information that Brian was able to get from these satellite transmitters. So this is the time of day on the y-axis or the vertical axis. And this is the percent of the time that the birds were active or moving. And so he knows that they're most active during the middle of the day, that they're diurnal birds, so they're not active at night. He was also able to break that out by male and female. And then also we were able to learn where exactly these birds were migrating. Before this study, we didn't have a good idea of where these birds went in the winter during migration. And so these birds were all captured and tagged at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And so we're able to track these birds all during their migration to see where they go. Here's some more detail on the times that we found these birds and where they were at specific times of day. These lines that you see, the purple lines, are military training routes. So we were able to intersect those training routes with the bird movements. Okay, and again, I apologize for the lack of detail on each of these studies I'm able to give you. I'll be happy to talk with you more about any of this during the break, but in order to get to several of these studies, to give you an idea of what we're doing, I can't go into too much depth on each one. As you heard during the last presentation, turf grass is a very common widespread type of land use at airports. In fact, I would call it the default land use at airports. Especially in the US, there's turf grass everywhere. And when I first came to the field station in 2008, I believe it was, I began to wonder just how much turf grass there was at airports in the United States. So I had a biologist at the time who was very good at geographic information systems, and he did a study and found that in total, there's over 3,300 square kilometers of airport grasslands in the United States. That's bigger than the state of Rhode Island in the United States, just in airport grasslands. So because there's so much grass at airports, we needed to learn more about what types were best to grow. The problem, unlike here, the problem in the United States, the primary problem with turf grass is that geese, Canada geese, like to eat it. They directly eat grass, but they're very picky on the types of grass we found out that they like to eat. So, and Canada geese, by the way, are, if not the most problematic bird species, they're definitely in the top 2 or 3 in terms of birds we're most concerned about on and around airports. They're a very heavy bird, there's a lot of them, and when they also fly in flocks. And all of those things put together make them extremely hazardous for aircraft. So years ago, we conducted a series of studies where we grew different types of grass in these patterns at our field station. I don't know if any of these grass grow down here or not, I'm not sure. But we captured geese and we put them in these pens. These geese had their wings clipped so they couldn't fly away. And we put them in these pens and then sat and just watched them for a long time. And this was, again, a series of studies. And by watching these geese and these different types of grass, we got to learn what types they like to eat and what types they didn't like to eat. Being a biologist is fun work, but occasionally we do strange things, like we study the pecks per minute by geese in certain types of grass. I always get funny looks when I show this, but we looked at the pecks per minute in these different types of grass, and you can see if you're at an airport in an area where these types of grass will grow, that's a pretty good choice for you at those airports because the geese really don't like it. Kentucky bluegrass was like candy to these birds, so we want to avoid Kentucky bluegrass as much as we can. And as you heard in the last presentation, however, this is not the only consideration that you have to think about when you decide what type of grass to grow. Airports, at least in the US, by and large, have very poor soils, so we also have to consider what types of grass will grow in these places. Over the past several years, well, I should back up for a second and say, we're a part of the Wildlife Services program in the Department of Agriculture. And so we do the research in my office, but we also have an operational branch that actually conducts wildlife management at airports. And as a matter of fact, we were active, our operations branch, at over 800 airports in the United States last year. So it's a very, very large program. But my office often gets calls and questions from all of these biologists in the field about how best to manage wildlife at their airports and different questions like that. The one question I've received more than any other over the past several years has to do with alternatives to turf grass. And generally what happens is the airport comes to our biologists and they say, we need to do something else with this land. It's costing too much money to cut this grass. We're trying to become more environmentally friendly, so we don't want to be out there mowing the grass all the time. What else can we do other than turf grass at my airport that will not attract hazardous wildlife? So we began a series of experiments several years ago to try to determine what types of land use might be compatible with safe airport operations from this wildlife perspective. Now, keep in mind, I'm not necessarily talking about right along the runways. There are, of course, rules that you have to follow about obstructions near runways, that types of thing. But airports, many airports anyway, are very, very large. And in some cases, even in the areas very far away from the runways and taxiways, they're still just cutting the grass. And so we began to look to see if there are alternatives to turf grass in some of those areas far away from the airport operations areas. So we've been looking at non-harvested herbaceous ground covers, different types of agriculture, solar arrays, which is the one I'll tell you about here in just a second, and also other alternative energy production types. We have a grant right now from the U.S. military where we're studying switchgrass, which is a native tall prairie grass in the United States. And it's used as a biofuel. And so we're looking to see if large expanses of turf grass are compatible with safe airport operations. But the study I want to tell you about is solar arrays. So I don't know the answer to this question, so I will ask. Are there many solar arrays at airports here in Brazil? Is that something that's happening at all? I wouldn't be surprised if it's coming, because in the United States it's become very popular to install solar arrays at airports. This is a very small airport right near us in Ohio, and you can see a huge photovoltaic solar array on each side of the runway. This is Denver International Airport in Colorado. Denver now has 4 very large solar arrays on their airport. Here's an example of the considerations that airports are using. Here's the solar array at Fresno Yosemite Airport. This is in California, by the way, on the far west coast of the United States. It's 2.4 megawatts, this photovoltaic array, constructed in 2008. It occupies less than 1% of the total property of the airport, but it supplies more than 60% of the energy demand for that airport. So you can imagine, as you start getting more and more of these solar arrays, it really is very helpful to the airport from an ecological, environmental perspective, but also from a monetary perspective. This airport projected $19 million in savings over 20 years over their original type of energy production there at the airport. And as a matter of fact, the Federal Aviation Administration in 2010 put out this publication telling airports how to go about putting solar arrays on their airports. So this publication talks about the types of land you can use for solar arrays, how you go about getting money to put them in. But they didn't put any information in there at all about potential wildlife hazards. So after this was published, they came to us and said, oh, by the way, is this going to be a problem? And so that's often how things go, I'm afraid. So we designed a study because it was conceivable to us that these could be an attractant to birds on the airport, because 2 things that are in very short supply at airports are perches and shade. And especially in some of these desert areas where these solar arrays work very well, we began to wonder if this could create a bird attractant. So we set up a study in 3 U.S. states, Ohio, Arizona, and Colorado, and we compared the bird, and I'm just going to talk about birds here, but we compared bird and mammal use of these 2 land cover types, the solar arrays and then the airport grassland, which is usually what is replaced by the solar arrays. And we emphasized the high-risk species here, so we're most concerned with the bigger birds that are likely to cause damage when they're struck. And the overall idea here was to provide this guidance to the Federal Aviation Administration and airports about this type of land use. I want to skip the methods. We counted birds in both these different types of land covers. We analyzed the data, and this again is a published study. It was published in 2014. Let me know if you want the citation and you can read it. But we essentially found that it doesn't appear to be a problem in most areas. So this on the y-axis is a bird hazard index. So this is a way that we calculated the risk that birds pose to aircraft. And then the seasons on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis. The solar arrays, or the full photovoltaic arrays, are this dark gray color, and then the airfields are here in this hatched bar. And they're about the same in the fall and spring. There was a little more hazard represented by the photovoltaic array in the summer, and a little less in the winter, but overall it was about the same. So we concluded from this study that in most areas, luckily, since it was already something that was happening, that these solar arrays did not appear to increase the hazard posed by birds at your airport. So this was really good news. Okay, the next study I want to tell you about pretty briefly is about this acoustic hailing device. And this is the acoustic hailing device right here. This is a colleague of mine, Jim Beasley, that's at the University of Georgia in the United States. And again, this I should say this is something that's already happening, that there are certain groups that are using these acoustic hailing devices to try to disperse birds. However, there was no study that had ever been done looking at whether they're effective for certain bird species at dispersing them or not. And the idea here is that we might be able to use these acoustic hailing devices if there are birds, let's say on a stormwater pond at the airport. We could use this to disperse them away from that pond. Or if there's a certain type of, if there's a wetland nearby the airport, can we use this to get these birds off the wetland? And this is just a big, it's a speaker. It's a speaker that produces extremely loud noises. But the special thing about this speaker is that it produces sound in a very narrow beam. It's not just like a speaker at a concert. It's a very focused, narrow beam. And it's essentially like an iPod. You can play whatever sounds you want through this. I always wanted to take my guitar and hook it up to that thing, but I was not allowed. That was my goal. But we used the sounds that the manufacturer of this device suggested that we use in our testing. You may have heard the term LRAD, or Long Range Acoustic Device. That's another name for this piece of equipment. It was developed actually for long distance communications and also non-lethal crowd control by the military. So the military uses these on ships, for example, to keep pirates or other people away from valuable places. And again, like I said, it projects this sound in a very narrow beam. So we wanted to evaluate the efficacy of this acoustic hailing device as a dispersal tool. And generally our methods were before and after counts of birds. So we would count all the birds in an area, and then after a while we would use this device. And this study just came out in publication, by the way, so it's available as well. And we did this study in South Carolina and Georgia on a very large controlled area where we knew there were many different types of birds that we could target, and where we knew that there weren't going to be people that would get in the way of the study. And in a nutshell, this is what we found. This is the percent reduction in bird numbers. So the very tall bars, the high numbers, means that this was very effective. The very low numbers means that it was ineffective. We found that it worked extremely well for vultures and worked extremely well for gulls. However, it did hardly worked at all for blackbirds or ducks or coots. I don't know why. I don't know why it was very effective for some and not for others. But some birds, it was very clear they just did not care. I'll tell you one little anecdote. A colleague of mine with the FAA first tested one of these, and there was a dove on a telephone wire. And he pointed this at the dove on the telephone wire and projected the sound, and the dove just sat there and acted like nothing was going on. He took 2 steps and clapped his hands, and it flew away. So, I don't know. I think if we were to do more work on this study, we would actually study the auditory systems of different types of birds to find out what different species can hear and what might be the best sounds to use to target certain bird species. Keep in mind there are 10,000 species of birds in the world roughly. They have different visual systems, they have different auditory systems, and so all birds are alike. And we didn't, again, target specific sounds to these specific species. We just used the same sounds for all in this first study. So it could be that if with more time in development, we might be able to get some more effectiveness for these different birds. I'm not sure at this time. This is a figure from the study. Here we have treatment, so this is where we had before and after, and this is the control sites where we had no use of the device. And you can see here's the initial count and here's the final count. So you had very big reductions for gulls, very big reductions for vultures, but no differences in the control counts. So that showed us that it was legitimate. Okay, this next one's kind of fun. Very often we need access to devices that will scare birds away, and we need devices that they don't habituate to or become used to real easily. And as Dr. Dolbeer talked about earlier, and some others have mentioned, very often if you do not reinforce those non-lethal methods with shooting, with killing, that they become ineffective over time. So the start of this study was to try to find a device that would scare birds away that they didn't become habituated to. And this air whip was developed by a South African company called Aztec Electronics as a non-lethal area repellent. I can't find this company anymore on the internet. I don't know if they went out of business, but I can't find them anymore. And this is a very simple device. It's just compressed air that moves through a hose, and it creates a hissing noise. I'll show you a video here in a second. I hope the video works. And produces a movement. I don't think it looks much like a snake, but they said it looked like a snake. We have no idea, no literature on how useful it is. So we set up a study to determine if this erratically moving hose, this air whip, prevents Canada geese from using a location. And this first study we were able to go for 3 hours, and this was a controlled study with birds that we captured and brought in to the field site. So the way we set this up, we had 3 experiments with 6 replicas for each of these experiments. And we had a stationary hose in one treatment, so we staked the hose all the way down so it created the sound but no movement. That was the first treatment. The second treatment was the full thing, so the moving hose, it's hissing and moving around. And the third one, we needed a control, so we just put a black flag out there to see if they reacted to that or not. So first what we did was we determined which side of this pen the birds like to be in. So imagine this is an enclosed fenced area. This is the air whip. We had one on each side. And then we looked to see where these birds like to be, on the left side or on the right side. And once we determined where they like to be, we activated that hose in one of these 3 treatments to see if it scared them away to the other side, and then to see when it stopped working. So can we play this video? Is it going to work? Well, that's too bad. I'll have to describe it to you. So this is the hose right here, and I apologize for the video not working, but it moves around, the geese go away. The geese did respond to the air escaping from the hose when it was staked down, but they really responded when it was moving. We found that the birds very soon ignored the sound without the movement, and there was no reaction to the control. So I won't go into what these number means, but just keep in mind the larger number means it was more effective. And so this is when the hose was staked down, and this is when it was moving all around. You can see the numbers are all bigger here when it was moving around. So essentially we found that when the whole thing was working and it was moving around and producing the sound, it worked quite well at keeping the birds away. So the next stage for this study is to take it out in the field, away from the controlled environment, and also to go for a much longer time to see how long it takes for them to habituate to this, if it ever does. Okay, radar. After the Hudson River bird strike, the Flight 1549, there was an increased emphasis put on avian radar because this was a strike away from the airport environment. There was nothing that the airport could have done to prevent that strike. So we were asked to actually evaluate one of these commercially available avian radars to see how well it did in detecting and tracking birds. So this is the radar that we tested. This is a Merlin radar that's produced by a company called DeTect, which is located in Florida in the United States. And we set up a study at the Terre Haute Airport. This is in the western part of Indiana in the US. And so we put the radar there at the airport, and then we had sites at different distances away from this radar where we would search for birds to see if the radar was detecting those birds. This NM means nautical miles is the distance that we were using in this study. And I should point out that the habitat here is really flat. There's not many hills. It was a really good environment for a radar to work in. So, as part of this study, we had observers out that were looking for certain types of birds, and then if we saw those birds, we located them and then went to the radar to see if it was also tracking those birds that we knew were there. So this is for the horizontal radar, the one that moves, the antenna that moves this way rather than this way. On this axis is the percentage of time tracked. So this was the percentage of time that the birds should have been tracked. How much of that time were they actually tracked? And this is two different altitudes, low birds less than 500 feet and high birds more than 500 feet. And in general, we found that it really wasn't all that effective at tracking single birds. So this is for single turkey vultures, which Weber told us about earlier, the turkey vultures. And this is for single red-tailed hawks. So most of the time, regardless of how far it was away from the airport for the most part, the radar didn't do a real good job of tracking these individual soaring birds. It was generally less than 30% of the time it should have been tracking them and actually was. Now for flocks, it was quite a bit better. So this is for small flocks, medium flocks, and large flocks. This is Canada geese, and these are ducks. And again, this is near the radar unit, the blue lines, 0 to 2 nautical miles. The red lines are 2 to 4 nautical miles. And it was still not a great performance by the radar, but it was quite a bit better than what we saw for the single birds. Depending on flock size, it could be up to 60, 70, 80% of the time these birds were tracked when they should have been. So this is a much, much better result. Let me go back to that for a second. Our conclusion for this study was not that you shouldn't have radars. The conclusion with this study was that you need to understand the limitations of the radars so you will know what they are useful for and what they're not useful for at airports. So I think there is a place for radar in the management of birds around airports. You just have to understand the limitations of the system that you have. Okay, this next study I want to talk about is new. I hired a postdoctoral researcher about a year ago. She's been here almost a year. And her job is to look at strikes outside the airport environment. So this is similar to the earlier talk we heard today with the geographic information systems. Our prediction here was that the strike rate would differ across airports because of the surrounding landscape matrix and the land uses. So here we are using the Federal Aviation Strike Database to look at the adverse effect strike rate at a sample of 100 airports around the United States. And we standardized per 10,000 aircraft movements, and we only used Part 139 airports. That just refers to certificated airports, or the larger passenger airports, not the very small civil aviation or general aviation airports. And this is our sample of airports. Each dot was an airport. We selected these randomly across the United States. We had a total sample size of 100 of these certificated larger airports. And we compared the strike rate at these 100 airports at 3 different radii away from the airport: 3 kilometers, 8 kilometers, and 13 kilometers outside of that airport environment. And these were the predictors in our models. So they were based on the ecology of the species. It's not important that you understand each and every one of these, but we looked at how diverse the landscape was. In other words, was it completely homogeneous? There was only crops, for example, or was it a very diverse landscape with many different types of land uses? That was one variable. We also looked at crops and crop diversity. We looked at water patches, wetland patches, open space, the distance from the other patches. My postdoc that did this got into the landscape ecology literature and really looked at the types of landscape variables that were most likely to influence animal movements and occupation. And these were our results. At that 3 kilometer, or the closest radius from the airport, we found that landscape diversity and crop area were the most significant predictors of this adverse effect bird strike rate. So this is interesting. To my knowledge, this is the first time that anyone's found this result, that the diversity of the landscape can actually affect the strike rate at the airport. At the 8 kilometer range, wetland patches, crop areas, water patches were the most significant predictors of bird strike rate. And at the largest range, it was water, again, crop edge and wetlands. So some of these are predictable, like the crops and the water, others not so predictable, like the landscape diversity. And this is an example of that variable landscape diversity. So here was our least diverse airport. You can see it was almost all, I believe that red color is urban area. So this was a very urban airport, nothing else going on, just urban. Compare that to this airport, which was extremely diverse, all kinds of different landscape elements in that radius away from the airport. And so, based on what we found, this was predicted to have a much higher bird strike rate than the very simple landscape. So our recommendations from this first effort that we've done is that land use is important. And so we need to start considering, probably not regulating, but at least considering landscape elements further out from the airport than what we currently do, because we now have evidence that it really does matter. Water, wetland, and crop attractants are important at these 3 different extents. And we need to use these results as a tool collaboration. As the other speaker mentioned today, we need to have better cooperation with the landowners surrounding the airport. So we're hoping we can use these results as a tool for negotiations with landowners outside of the airport environment. This last study I want to talk about today has to do with aircraft lighting. And we've been working on this for quite a few years now. And the idea here is that we want to be able to give the birds warning that the aircraft is coming. We did a study several years ago where we did necropsies or autopsies on birds that had been hit by aircraft. These birds were all collected along runways at an airport, and so we knew that they had been hit by aircraft. And then we looked on the body of the dead bird to see where on the body of the bird it was struck by the aircraft. Was it a random arrangement of injuries across the body, or were all the birds tend to be hit in certain areas? And what we found was that birds that were struck by aircraft tended to be hit on the bottom side, the ventral side of their bodies, and toward the back. And so what that indicated to us that the birds actually tried to escape the aircraft when it was coming at them. They just couldn't do so in time. Birds don't want to get hit. They're trying to escape. They just need a little bit earlier warning that the aircraft is coming so they have more time to get out of the way. So the idea here is that if we have this detection window when the aircraft's on the way, we want to be able to increase that detection window, give the birds a little bit more time. And this is a very, very involved process that involves collaborators at universities. I should say here, back up and say that birds see much differently than humans do. Again, there are many different types of birds. They all have a little bit different visual systems, but in general, birds see much better than we do. Some birds can see colors we cannot see. Some birds can see in the ultraviolet range, which we cannot. Some birds can see flicker much better than we can. So fluorescent lights that are used in many buildings actually pulse at about 60 times a second. We can't see that flicker. Most birds can see that flicker. Many birds can see almost all the way around their head, whereas we can't. So there are a lot of differences in the visual systems of birds and people. because of that, we just can't look at what type of light is the best warning for us. We actually have to study the visual systems of the birds to know what type of light would work best for them. So that's what we do in the laboratory. We look at the visual physiology of many different types of birds. We look at the visual field configuration, their acuity, the resolution, so how far away can they see objects, how sensitive are the cells in the eye that detect color and translate color to the brain. And then once we have that information about the visual systems of the birds, we do some mathematical modeling called perceptual modeling. And that's just a fancy way of saying we find out what types of lights best discern the aircraft from its environment. What makes that aircraft stick out the most to the birds. And then we take that information and the special lights, and we do behavioral experiments in the field to see if the lights actually increase the escape behaviors of the birds. So for part of this research, we've used remote control aircrafts. This is a couple of professors that we collaborate with. This is Esteban Fernandez-Hurisic at Purdue University. This is Steve Lima at Indiana State University, and that's Brad Blackwell. Brad's one of the biologists in my office who's been leading this research for many years. And the one study I want to tell you about very briefly today, we conducted several years ago. And in this study, we looked at Canada geese, and we wing clipped the birds so they couldn't fly and put them in an outside pen. And then we flew this remote-controlled aircraft toward the birds with these lights that we knew should advertise the presence of the aircraft. So we flew the aircraft with the lights and without the lights to see how the birds reacted. And what we found, that this is the white bars are with the lights, the black bars are without the lights. This is the first, this set of bars is the first bird in the group, its reaction, and this is the average or the mean alert for the group. And then on this axis, we have the seconds before that plane would have hit them when they actually showed their escape behavior. And to sum this up quickly, we could buy about 4 seconds with these lights. That they reacted to the aircraft 4 seconds sooner when the lights were on, these aircraft, than when the lights were off. So this tells us that this is a very promising line of research that we should continue to develop. The Federal Aviation Administration is funding this work, and what we're doing right now is trying to learn about the visual systems of different types of birds, the birds that we're most concerned about hitting in the United States. Vultures are coming up on the list, by the way, as birds that we want to look at their visual systems. And so the idea is once we learn about all these different types of visual systems of the birds and understand their behavior in response to these lights, then we can develop a lighting recipe in terms of the color of the light, its pulse frequency, how bright it is. The idea is to get this recipe for these lights that best advertise the presence of the aircraft to give these birds more time to get out of the way. And that's what I have for you today, and that's my contact information if any of you have questions for me. Thank you.
Perguntas?
Travis, thank you for coming. Eu sou piloto da Força Aérea Brasileira e, de fato, em alguns momentos o piloto reage quando avista a ave para desviar. Em outros momentos a gente percebe que realmente a ave nos ajuda. Ela fecha as asas, ela encolhe, mas o fato é que muitas vezes a gente não consegue...
Sorry, it just now came on. Sorry about that.
Ok. Não, eu estava dizendo que como piloto, muitas vezes a gente percebe que a própria ave, ela realmente nos ajuda. Ela encolhe, ela desce quando ela percebe de fato a aproximação da aeronave. Na Força Aérea a gente tem implementado o farol aceso quando está voando mais baixo, porque tomou conhecimento desse estudo que apontou para essa direção, de que o farol ele ajuda a ave a identificar a aeronave e assim se afastar. A pergunta é se existe algum estudo no sentido de outros sistemas, de outras tecnologias que ajudem a ave a detectar a aeronave mais distante, além dessa questão visual, talvez o sonoro, o radar, para ajudar também o piloto a perceber a aeronave, a perceber a ave em voo com mais tempo. Muito obrigado.
Yes, thank you for that question. We have studied radar energy because there has been some idea out there that the birds can sense the radar energy, and that if the radars are on, it might get the birds out of the way sooner. We did do a study on that, and we found that birds indeed can detect radar energy, but not at the distances away from the aircraft that would be helpful. So in other words, they could only detect the radar energy when they were too close for it to have mattered. In terms of sound, that's an interesting concept, and one we may well look at in the future. But the aircraft are so loud anyway, it would have to be a really amazing sound, I think, to work. We have decided to concentrate our research at this time on the lighting, because birds are very visual, very visual animals. And again, their visual systems are so advanced that we think we probably can make the best progress in the shortest amount of time with the lighting rather than the sounds. But sounds in some situations may well work, and it may be something we look at in the future.
Boa tarde. Eu queria saber se o painel, esses painéis solares, eles não atrapalham o piloto, a aviação na decolagem ou na aterrissagem.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And as a matter of fact, the U.S. military has looked at that exact question. And it turns out that the solar panels do not appear to provide any problems most of the time. There may be very certain instances where it could be problematic, but overall, these panels actually produce less glare than asphalt around the airport. Remember, these panels are designed to absorb energy rather than reflect it. So by and large, it's not problematic, and probably much less problematic than water features and asphalt and other things that are already there.
Mais alguém?
Oi, eu sou a Viviane. Eu sei que a discussão aqui é toda virada para a região de aeroporto, mas eu gostaria de saber se você tem algum conhecimento de acidente com aeronaves, provavelmente helicóptero, quando operam nas plataformas de petróleo. Porque a gente sabe que as plataformas de petróleo servem como puleiros ou outras coisas para as aves, e a gente está tendo um grande problema aqui no Brasil com isso. E eu quero saber se tem alguma pesquisa feita, algum método que você utiliza lá fora, se você tem conhecimento dele.
We have looked at helicopter strikes, and we've published several papers over the past few years that have characterized what helicopter strikes tend to look like. Helicopters typically fly lower, of course, and so most strikes to helicopters are en route rather than during takeoff and landing, which is different than fixed-wing aircraft. And also, most strikes to helicopters usually impact the windshield or the windscreen or the rotor blades. I'm actually on a committee right now with the FAA looking at increasing bird strike protections for helicopters in that country, because over the past several years there have been quite a few strikes, and there was one actually at an oil rig with a red-tailed hawk in Louisiana that killed some people. So we are looking at that, and the emphasis right now is on improving the strength of the windscreen so that it can better withstand a bird impact. So they're very well, it's still in process, but there very well may be new bird strike protections coming out in the United States, looking at strengthening those parts of the aircraft that are most likely to be hit. I will say that the other thing we found recently, which is particularly, I think, applicable to helicopters, is that the speed of the aircraft, it appears to have a very big impact on whether there's going to be a strike or not. The faster you go, the less able the birds are to get out of the way. And that may seem intuitive, but we actually have experimental evidence that for certain birds, once you get past a certain threshold speed, they're unable to get out of the way in time because they can't process that vehicle coming at them that quickly. And so one of the recommendations we have for helicopter pilots is that if you have a situation where you can fly slower in areas where there are a lot of birds, you should do so. Now, certainly there are instances when they just can't slow down. But for example, tour helicopters that are taking people on tours like in Hawaii, they found that if they slow way down when they're in certain areas, they have fewer bird strikes.
Travis, here. Vocês consideraram nos trabalhos relacionados ao landscape e a proporção de colisões algo semelhante ao que a gente chama de aterro sanitário, alguma coisa assim, local de deposição final de resíduos sólidos?
That's what we just started, actually. So that first study was looking at more broad landscape factors, and the study that we just began is looking at specific attractants that are in the landscape, like landfills, fish farms, trash transfer facilities. That's actually where we're going right now, so that was the logical next step, yes.
Oi, aqui. Hoje de manhã, na minha apresentação, mostrei essas diferenças que podem ocorrer de urubu de cabeça vermelha ter mais colisão dentro do aeroporto e fora do aeroporto ser cabeça preta. E ontem, conversando, você me disse que lá os dois é mais comum fora do aeroporto. Você atribuiria isso a alguma ação que é desenvolvida dentro do aeródromo como dispersão, ou é mais pelo comportamento de voo deles que são mais altos? E a gente sabe que de um lugar para o outro essas duas espécies podem ter comportamentos diferentes. Nos Estados Unidos pode ser de um jeito, aqui no Brasil de outro.
I think part of the reason why we have more strikes outside of the airport is that at so many of the airports they're being harassed by our biologists, for one thing. So they're being pushed away from the airport as often as possible. We do have a lot still of airport strikes with vultures. It's just that there are probably because of that harassment, there are slightly more outside of that airport environment for those two species. But very much like here, now not to the extent you have it here, but certainly those two species are very problematic for us in the United States as well. Now we have more problem with turkey vultures overall than black vultures, but I think that's just because the turkey vultures are present across the entire country, whereas the black vultures are only in the southeastern part of the country.
Obrigada, Travis. Thank you.
Thank you.